right. Well, hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's BU career webinar. So you want to work remotely? I don't know if there's a question mark on the end of that or not, but that's how I read it in my head, Scott. My name is Jeff Murphy. I'm a member of the career programs team in the Office of Alumni Relations. Today's webinar is offered to our 352,000 alumni around the globe and all of our current students. Throughout your career, BU is committed to helping you define and achieve your professional goals, and we aim to do this by providing alumni and students with access to a series of valuable online tools and social media communities. Again, as mentioned before we got started, we've got alumni and students joining us from some very far away places today. Please know that we really do value your participation in this and every event that we offer. Before I introduce today's speaker, a couple housekeeping notes for you. Today's presentation is being recorded and will soon be made available for on-demand viewing on the BU Alumni and Friends website, which you can find at bu.edu/alumni. And our speaker today is very eager to answer any questions you may have. You're welcome to submit them throughout the presentation using the Q&A function. Similar to the chat, you're going to hover over your screen, see the toolbar pop up and click on Q&A. Go ahead and type your question in at any time. We're going to save lots of time to get to those today. You can also use the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on that. So just let us know what you want to talk about. It's a great opportunity to hear from somebody that I think of as a true expert on this subject. Speaking of him, our speaker for the day is BU College of Arts and Sciences alumnus Scott Singer. As founder and president of Insider Career Strategies LLC, Scott guides individuals and corporate clients through the job search and hiring process, consulting on resume writing and interview coaching, to developing LinkedIn profiles and helping professionals manage their image, providing outplacement services, and bringing unique insight into what employers want and need in the world of talent. Scott has his bachelor's degree from Boston University, as well as an MBA from the University of Michigan, Dearborn. And he's also a globally recognized, he holds globally recognized certifications in career coaching and resume writing. He also is a member of the Forbes Coaching Council. Scott, we are always delighted. You've done so many of these webinars for us. You've been somebody that I will have back as many times as you will speak to our community, because you just offer this amazing content. I'm so glad to have you here today. Why don't we go ahead, have you get your slide deck up and running, and then the floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Let me get up and running here. And there we go. All right. So thank you, Jeff. You hear me okay?
Yep. Sounds perfect.
Perfect. All right. So thank you to everybody that's joining us today. I do want to, as Jeff had mentioned, keep this conversational. So Jeff and I will keep an eye on the chat and the questions. Today we're talking about working remotely. So here we are. We've had COVID and we're in the work anywhere economy. So are we really there? Is it going to stay that way? Let's dive in. So first and foremost, everybody here on the call, I'm assuming, has gotten a taste of working remotely. So you've had to deal with COVID-19, right? You're still going ahead and, you've huddled at home, but, business still happens. So, here you were, you've been able to save money on gas. You've been able to better use your commute time. Instead of just listening to, that audio book, you're actually spending time, 45 minutes to an hour at home instead, and actually getting caught up on work and family stuff. You are able to work without your boss looking over your shoulder, although we'll get into that in a moment. But, control over your work environment. Here it is. Everybody works better in certain settings. Maybe a cubicle or, huddled on top of everybody is not the way you want to work. Here it is. You've been able to set up your home work environment. Also improving your access to the outdoors. God knows I've seen a lot of my friends and acquaintances and clients who set up shop in the remote areas. They had a vacation home somewhere, or they decided to decamp. Reduce your dry cleaning bill. Here we are, used to do suits, and now everybody, is coming to their work doing a Zoom presentation in their pajamas. And then, of course, not paying for daycare. If you've got kids, that was an expensive thing you've had to do. Although I'm sure there are some folks who would have appreciated and enjoyed still having the children there in the daycare. Seeing more of your family and, of course, your pets. That's my little girl, Olive. She has been very happy to get more of me over the past year and a half. So yeah, no, I mean, I think that, there's been a lot of benefits that we've all incurred from working remotely. And it's, there's been some positives, but of course there's been some negatives too. We'll talk about that. But as far as, the way that it actually works. So, here's the perception, right? Here's what your boss is thinking. You've got employers, maybe it's your current employer, maybe it's, maybe it's other, employers, they're all thinking, here you are, it's, maybe or maybe not, you've got your, you've got your laptop at the beach and you're sitting there and just kind of staring out into space and enjoying things. Which, don't get me wrong, it's a beautiful thing, but that's really not what has necessarily been happening. So a lot of employers have been anxious to get everybody back into the office for a variety of reasons: cultural, operational, control. But the reality, I think, has been something more like this. It just happens to be more virtual. The work hasn't gone away. We're still doing tons and tons of work. We've got a lot of tasks that we're working on. We still have our accountabilities. In the end, to borrow an old Dunkin' Donuts campaign, you still got to make the donuts. So, there are some perception questions in terms of how, how that works. So, let's dive in today's evolving world of work, right? So, the truth of the matter is that remote work didn't come because of philanthropy. It didn't come because, the boss all of a sudden got a big heart, right? There were always some people that, that had the opportunity to work from home, but it was a pretty small percentage. I think the figure that I saw before was corporate people. It was in the range of about 5% who had arranged that they could work home full time. Well, here it was COVID. Everyone was worried about transmission, and employers did implement this out of necessity. And they, in doing so, discovered that it actually can work on a large scale. Is it sustainable in the long term? Maybe, maybe not, but there was that discovery. So, where we are right now is that the jury's still out. Is this going to be something that you and I and everybody else are going to be able to continue to do on a remote basis? We've got, a situation where, employers, a lot of them have felt like they've lost control of what's going on. But, I think there's also a push and pull. And I'm sure everybody on this call has felt some of that, where they want to make sure that they still have this opportunity to work remotely when they want to. In terms of companies, there's been a lot of surveys that have been there, and the source data is here. You'll see it in a moment. But they said that, approximately 25% of the work that's out there could remain remote. Now, I want to make something very clear. You'll notice I'm using the word work and not workers. And the reason being that companies will classify jobs based on whether or not there's something that can very reasonably or feasibly be done on a remote basis. So from that standpoint, they're looking at 25% of the work could still remain remote. One of the biggest challenges that employers have is, and employees too, let's be very honest about this, is, it's not just about whether or not the work gets done, right? There's a balance. There's company culture. These places that have always, been wonderful places to work, for example, and have a lot of in-office amenities. They've built an esprit de corps. There's engagement, which isn't necessarily the same thing as happiness. You'll hear this term workforce engagement. And what that really means is that people are really dialed in on what they're doing. They're being responsible. They're being, for lack of a better word, engaged with their coworkers and their work. And then, of course, P&L performance. Companies have a lot of operating costs, and sometimes to be able to, keep that operating cost, but also to get more on the revenue side, there may be a perception that they need people in there. And then, of course, there's control. Yes, I mean, the truth of the matter is the employers do want to control what happens within their organizations. And I've been throughout my career, I've had many employers, bosses, some of whom were, hey, great, you want to work from home a few days? No problem. Take the computer and do it. But I've also had others that believe that if you weren't there, you weren't doing work, you were just sitting at home watching Gilligan's Island reruns. So it's, there's definitely a lot of balance there that companies have to look at. As far as other factors, right now they're evaluating their business models, and there's many pieces that go into this. So, there's determining whether or not they're going to go in person. I'm sure you've seen the news. There's certain employers, for example, Goldman Sachs, one of the big bankers, I think JP Morgan Chase, they were all pushing to see when they can get everybody back into the office. They feel that they're giving the paycheck, they're paying well, they need people to come back there. There's also the remote, fully going remote. There's also blended. I know of a lot of employers that their long-term plan, at least in terms of what they're talking about, is some sort of situation where, you're working 2 days a week or 3 days a week in the office, and then the balance of the time you're going to work remotely. I also had a conversation with somebody today where they had said, instead of calling it remote, they were saying wherever you feel like you work best. So, there are people that feel like they do work best in the office, but there's also people that would rather work at home and hang out with their dogs and cats and their family. So, it's really a matter of what's going to be an appropriate situation for the folks. So, by the way, I do want to make clear that if you do have questions as we go along, feel free to put them into the questions portal or in the comment section, and we'll certainly tackle those at an appropriate time. Another thing is that corporate real estate is playing a factor here. Now, companies built their offices for workforces that were largely in place. And what's happening is that companies have these fixed costs. They either own the buildings or they have these long-term leases. So they want to be able to justify them, and they can't get out of the real estate leases or the deals very easily. So as they go through the equation, they're trying to think about, okay, what leases do we have starting to expire? How are we going to be able to minimize our footprint from that standpoint? A lot of companies have gone towards LEED, which is environmental friendly. Maybe there's ways that they can reorganize their real estate portfolio so it's going to be more socially responsible. And then, of course, COVID-19 is still in the equation. I don't know about everybody here on the call. I'm curious to hear about you and whether or not you've gone back to work. Please feel free to, whether you've gone back into the office, feel free to leave a comment on the chat. But, about 4 months ago, 5 months ago, we were all ready. I was starting to see clients back in my office, and then Delta variant came along. And next thing you know, I've been pulling that back and been going back to remote. So, it's definitely a difficult situation. And I think there's a lot of questions that are not answered at this point. So let's take a look then. We have a comment here. Yeah, somebody on Andrea's hybrid schedule. Sim still work from home in Southern California. So, we're going to see, there's going to be a blend there. Another individual. Oh, Gracie, I'm so sorry to hear that you were let go. And Kinderman back in the office full time in Connecticut since May. So, and I'm sure, by the way, when you've gone back into the office, I'm sure there's probably been some, mandates in terms of wearing masks or keeping some space. Whitney, sorry to hear you were let go as well. So, yeah, we're seeing kind of the variety of what's going on here. So, I think that one of the things is, here it is, you're thinking, okay, well, I did have the opportunity to work remote. Is it really a good idea? And, I do want to preface this with a comment, which is that I think that when it comes to remote, I think that, we're kind of in a negotiation in terms of what's going to make the most sense for work. There are so many different factors, and I don't know that everybody has really thought through all of these factors. So let's kind of go through these. The visibility factor. I'm sure here everybody has heard about the whole idea of FaceTime, and yes, there is an element of that. I think that the people that are given a choice, I think the folks that are going to make the choice to go back into the office and are going to see their bosses may have more opportunities, and a lot of that's going to be due to chance encounters. It's going to be a visual perception that, hey, this individual's committed, they're here and they're doing the work. I'm not saying it's necessarily correct, but I'm saying that that is a perception. Another one is trust. as I mentioned, there are bosses that simply just do not trust. They don't want to give people that leash to go ahead and to work remotely. They don't feel that the trust is there. But on the other hand, there are also people that have outstanding relationships with their managers, and they've been good in terms of the deliverables. So, there is a factor there to consider. Another one is corporate dynamics, the interactions in politics. So let's go back to this. By the way, I'm seeing some other comments, fully remote. Another one is Lyle has had work push remote for a while until they figure things out again. Another one, 100% remote, except for when my events happen on campus. Okay, for calm. So, if you are let's give an example. Let's say that you are working for a company like a Goldman Sachs that said, we really want everybody here. And, maybe you have an arrangement with your manager. The truth of the matter is that, even if you've arranged to work remotely, we are all managed. We have bosses. They may not be an immediate boss, but there may be several levels up. And what you'll see is that there will be perceptions that will go up and down the flagpole. So you need to very carefully think about this. Are the people that are there in person, are you going to, I can't tell you how many times I've been in the office and somebody had seen me, working on on a particular project. They realized that, I had some skills that would work on another project, and I got tapped for those. And a lot of that was due to the fact that I was there and, and just seeing what's happening and being seen. Another one is learning by osmosis. I don't know if you know what osmosis is. Osmosis is a chemical process where things are just kind of absorbed into a body. For folks that are particularly junior in their career, or if you've changed paths, sometimes that's the best way to learn. You're seeing what's happening around you. Maybe you've observed a coworker who has, I'm watching this chat. This is hysterical. So, I've seen coworkers who, handled a difficult situation in a particular way. And I said, okay, you know what, that's an approach I'm going to take in the future. Sometimes it's building your strategic or your technical acumen. So, I think you're going to see that there's a lot of different pieces you learn that way. Another one to consider is the career level or entry point. Reputations are made by relationships. The truth of the matter is that if you're coming into an organization and if you are there at the very beginning of your career, a lot of times what's going to get attention is, that one time that you were in front of everybody and you made a presentation. And sometimes that happens through, Zoom, but more often, it's how you carry yourselves in the hallway. It's how you carry yourselves in meetings. It's the physical and, visual interactions. So there are pieces to consider. And of course, the earlier you are in your career, the more you're going to want to build expertise. And you can't always capture that by remote or by email. Also, a lot of this is, people that just, I've observed many times people that just haven't, they're here early in their career, they get in there, they don't get the coaching or support that they need because it's more difficult by Zoom, and they just haven't felt as engaged as a result. So they've moved on to other companies and opportunities. Network growth. Again, this is all about relationships. Oops, I apologize. Let me pull this back up. Sorry. When you're talking about meeting people, a lot of this happens in the office. Chance encounters, people that you end up sitting next to in the cafeteria by talking. And by the way, I want to make one thing very clear. My point of view throughout my career has been very employee focused. I just want people to understand my perspective. I tend to view, the employers as the root of a company's success. I think that's very natural. But I also think that companies have a right to certainly get things done in a way that's going to be appropriate and the best. But a lot of it is companies have built cultures over the years that are here to promote several of these different factors. Another one is management duties. And if you have a lot of managerial responsibility and maybe you haven't really managed people much in person, sometimes doing this from the standpoint of in person and kind of getting your bearings is going to help. Also, it really depends. I mean, management is a learned skill like anything else. It's like a learned technical skill. So the more that you can, learn over the years and see people and model what they're doing might be beneficial. But there are also people that have leadership inherent, that they've, worked on it and developed it and can manage remotely as well. Geography. I don't know about most of the people on this call, but, I'm not seeing and hear a lot of New Yorkers or Bostonians. There are a couple. I see Alexis here, even coming from Medfield into Boston, I'm sure is a hell of a commute. Also coming in from, New York metro area spans 4 states, goes all the way into Pennsylvania. Oh, there you go, Malden. Taking the T from Malden into Boston can be a real chore as well. Especially when you've got traffic. I live in Miami and the traffic is just horrendous. It was taking me about an hour and a half to travel 20 miles when I was commuting to a job. So, the geography can make a huge difference. What are the resources you have? How many planes, trains, and automobiles you have to have? Career ambition. People change careers, they move into different fields. But again, of course, sometimes that visual visibility. Hey, Gracia Alvarez is also from Miami. The more career ambition you have, sometimes the in-person versus remote can make a difference. Of course, distractions. Now, there are distractions at work and there are distractions at home, right? For all of us that work at home or from a home office, there's the kids, there's the pets. As wonderful as they are, you want to be able to confine them to certain hours. The last thing you need is someone screaming behind you while you're doing a Zoom call. But also there's distractions at work. Maybe you're in a high traffic hallway and an open cubicle, which can be an impediment to getting a lot of work done. So, you need to think about that as a factor. And then of course the job function and the structure. What I mean by this is, I'll give you an example. JetBlue, the airline, has most of their travel agents, most of their reservations and service agents working remotely from home. And that's okay. These are folks that, they have a plugged in line, it connects to their system. People can go ahead and just, they can handle their calls. It doesn't really matter so much what the collaboration is. On the other hand, if you're a project manager or you're a functional manager, sometimes being in person can add that extra level of functionality and control that can help you drive things across the business line. Okay, compensation and benefits. Who here, I'd love to see, in the chat some comments, but who here has had a conversation with their employer about what their compensation is going to look like if they continue to work remotely? Love to see your comments here, but we've got employers. Some are saying that, some employers are saying, we're going to keep you the same no matter where you are. We realize that there's a remote work element. We have other employers. So for example, an employer is saying that, they are based in New York and, they say, okay, well, that's great, but New York is one of the most expensive markets. If you want to go ahead and live in Indiana, for example, we're going to go ahead and we're going to, we want you to earn less because it's not going to cost you as much. The commute's not going to cost as much. Real estate costs a fraction. So you're going to see these conversations. And also there is a perception that work from home is a benefit. The concept that, well, guess what? We don't have to, give you a cubicle and, it's going to cost less for us. We would like to have you pass along some of the savings. Vice versa. I've had some people say, and I'm not sure I agree with the standpoint, that you should pay me more to work remotely because now I'm using my home office. You don't have to pay for that. You don't have to pay for the real estate that I'm going to work at. And I'm seeing some comments here. It looks like there are some conversations that have been taking place about working. Somebody said that they're offered to work for less money. The thing to keep in mind about this is that compensation compounds. And here's what I mean by this is that let's say that 1 year you're earning $100,000 and you go ahead and, every year the company, it gives a cost of living increase, and maybe it's 2 or 3%. Well, if you're getting 3% on top of 100,000, That's a lot more money than 3% on 75,000 if you've taken a cut from work from home. So, there's other benefits too that you might be getting that you would give up if you work from home. So, for example, gym membership, if they have an on-site fitness facility at work. Different health insurance plans for different markets. I mean, there's a lot of different factors to look at in here. My personal belief, this is my personal belief, is that an employer shouldn't necessarily be asking for you to take a pay cut to work at home. You're still adding the same amount of value to the organization, but I think the companies, they spend a lot of time looking to add shareholder value. Are there other ways that they can find that? And you're seeing that companies are starting to downsize some of their real estate footprint. Work scope creep. Okay, folks, let's be honest here. Who has started getting work assignments and emails at later hours than they ever expected and are expected to have faster turnaround because their computer is always on and they're not commuting? It's real. It's very real. That 2 hours that you were spending commuting every day, there may or may not be a lot of sympathy that you're going to be spending time doing these additional responsibilities. So it happens. Another one is remote employee monitoring software. For those of you who haven't heard of this, Sim, warp scope creep, absolutely. Employers have been implementing monitoring software. Now, typically what's happened is that in the past, call center type work used to be the real domain for this, right? Companies would put in productivity software. They look to see what kind of work you're doing, what's your call rate. What's happening is that more and more of this is being pushed out to white collar employees. And you're seeing that employers are getting better visibility in terms of seeing how many keystrokes are you doing, what websites are you visiting. And this isn't just IT checking into this if there's an issue. This might be giving managers responsibility and ability to be able to see this. So you got to think about the privacy requirements. And I think what's going to happen is, this is just speculation, but I think a lot of this software is probably going to end up going into the office as well for folks there. And then, of course, last one, whether you live in Colorado, has anybody here, I'm going to explain this, but has anybody heard or looked at a job description that said this position is available to employees anywhere except Colorado? Here's the reason for this. Colorado passed a law that they have to post, employers have to post the salary range for a position. Well, what's happened is that, there's definitely a lack of symmetry in terms of the information that an employer asks, that an employer gives in terms of compensation versus the employee. So what's happened is that employers want to protect their employee, their power over what the compensation is for a state like California or New York or Alabama. They don't want to be able to give that information out because it's advantageous to them not to. So a lot of employers are posting on their job opportunities, this position is not available for Colorado candidates. So it is something that you'll probably want to figure out. And it'll probably, if you do live there, at least in the short term, it'll probably result in fewer remote opportunities. All right, so here's the factors. We've talked about this. We've talked about all the different pieces with this. So let's talk about how you actually go ahead and find a remote opportunity. All right, so here you are, you're doing the search. When you're going into the online job boards, right? You're going into Monster, Career Builder, Indeed, LinkedIn. You want to use the keywords that are going to pop up these jobs. So make sure that you're using terminology such as remote, virtual, offsite. These are terms that an employer is going to use in their job description. They may put percentage offsite or percentage onsite. I think personally the blended piece where it's going to be, a few days in, a few days off is probably going to become the norm. So, I would certainly consider taking a look at that in the job description. Now, another one is networking. You're going to find that employers, if you've got people that are in your network, and by the way, LinkedIn is an amazing tool. I definitely recommend using that to build your network aggressively. You may have people that are within your network that you can reach out to and say, hey, hey, Julie, I see that you work at company X. Is this a place where remote work is going to be feasible? And you can work with them to find out a little bit about the culture. What would certain departments do in terms of remote work versus not, and use that to network your way into a role, or at least to understand which groups to look at. Another thing that's very, very important is make sure to clarify your expectations up front. So here's what I mean. Some jobs may be fully remote versus hybrid. They may not necessarily clarify that in the in the job description itself. I think that's a question you want to ask. Also, is something going to be temporarily remote versus permanently remote? You may not have companies that have figured out what they're going to do in the long term. So I would suggest that if you do get into an interview, that you take a look at the job description, and then when you get to the interview, ask the question. I saw that this position is posted as a remote opportunity. Do you see this as short-term, long-term, something that's going to happen, for career long in this role? But the more that you can set those expectations up front, the better. My personal suggestion is, because we are still in a very vague situation, and a lot of employers don't really know what the future is going to hold. My advice is not to push too hard on that question until you really get down to brass tacks. You've got an offer, they tell you what the position is going to be in terms of in-person versus remote, and they're talking salary details with you. I would wait until you've actually proven that you're the candidate that they want. If you're a candidate that they are clearly interested in, you're going to have more leverage than somebody who's just putting out there immediately, I want to work remotely. So let's talk about other situations. Here you are, have your current employer, and you want to continue this remote work discussion. What do you do? So first of all, remember the golden rule. Who knows what the golden rule is? The golden rule is not treat people how you would prefer to be treated. That's the old one. That's the old saying. But the real golden rule is that he who has the gold makes the rules, meaning that an employer, you may not like their policy. You may not like the way that they decide that people are going to come back to work full time in the office. But the truth of the matter is, as long as they're giving a paycheck, it is their decision. Now, your decision is you don't necessarily have to continue to work for the organization, but the truth of the matter is that as long as what they're asking of you is legal, then they absolutely have the right to ask of it. So also make sure that you understand what the parameters are for remote work. What's the corporate policy? And by the way, I would take a look at what the company has in their employee handbook. What do they say about remote work? Because until they update that, until they come with firm policies, they may not necessarily have that. And then, of course, precedent. If you're seeing that, maybe pre-2001, that a lot of individuals have, were given the authorization to work remotely, then at least that'll give you some bargaining position as you go in there. But really understand what those parameters are. If you're in a company where it's just, the CEO has made clear 300 times in a row for 300 consecutive days, we want to get everybody back in the office. I think that's probably going to be a losing battle for you in terms of with that employer, and you may want to look elsewhere. Not saying it's impossible, but it is possible. So the other thing is that, okay, you've decided you really want to continue working remotely, whether it's on a permanent basis or a blended basis. The thing that's very important is don't just expect to get it because you ask. I think it's important for anybody who's asking for some sort of accommodation like this to build and present your business case. You really want to make it clear that you are going to be just as productive as you were working in person. So you want to talk about what's been your professional track record. If you've had very good performance appraisals, if you've consistently exceeded expectations, the structure of your job, does it lend it to working remotely? Are you going to be able to do that? If there's heavy duty capital equipment you need to use on a day-to-day basis, working remote might be more difficult. The metrics that you've had, if you can clearly demonstrate that your productivity has been exactly the same during and pre-COVID, and the productivity you've had, and it, maybe it's exceeded your peers, that's going to help. And of course, your deliverables. We all have deliverables, things that we're expected to do. But you want to make sure to very clearly articulate why is it that this is a good risk for you, and clearly present it. You want to talk about it. Make sure you support it with data. The more that you've been able to be a performer in the past, the more that someone's willing to take a chance on you. Here's the other piece that a lot of people don't understand as well, is you need to position your manager for success when it comes to presenting to their boss that they want to let their people work remotely. We all have a boss, everybody. And you want to be able to justify to them and give them ammunition so that they can adequately walk across the hall to their VP and say, here's why I think we should let this happen. And by the way, this is the exact same approach if you're asking for a raise or promotion that's out of cycle. Anytime that you want to get some sort of special dispensation, you want to make sure that you not only present a clear case, but you give your managers the tools that they need to be able to make that case for you. Be prepared to negotiate. There may be many factors. The number one factor that they may want to negotiate is whether or not you can even work remotely. But there may be compensation, there may be hours, there may be additional availability that you're going to do trade-offs. Maybe you're in sales and you've got a company car. Maybe that would come out of the equation. I don't know, but be prepared to negotiate. But the truth of the matter is that they're going to come up with an answer, listen to it, understand it, and then proceed from there. That's when you're going to make your decision about what you want to do next. They may come to you and they may say, listen, we've given this a lot of thought. We trust you. It's not that. We need to get everybody back here for the dynamics. Or they may just say, look, your track record was stronger before, we went to, remote work, and it slid a little bit when you did. Whatever they may say, the truth of the matter is you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot. You want to make sure that you still have a job to come to tomorrow. So hear their answer, understand what they're saying, ask for clarification if you need it, thank them for the consideration. And if this means that you go home and you start working on your resume for another job, so be it. It may also be that you decide, look, I love this job. I don't want to change. And, I want to make this work. So, really be strategic about this. The last thing you want to do is end up without a job at all. So in terms of final thoughts, and by the way, we'll open up some time for Q&A at the end of this. Many companies do build their culture around remote work. The one that I've seen recently was Twitter. Twitter has definitely built it to a situation where they want to be a remote company. So, I think an organization that is going to be focused on that is going to not only be a better chance, but they're probably going to provide you educational and cultural and social opportunities that will foster that as well. So that might be a better fit for you. Another one is that your company may fully embrace remote work or fully reject it. We don't know what the future is going to hold here. I think everybody is still feeling their way through this. So I think everybody was, after vaccinations got on the market, was pretty anxious that, yep, we were going to have this pretty clear. And Delta came along, and, there's a lot of factors that just haven't resolved themselves. So, I think this is still news to be delivered. Another one is that companies may be willing to take a chance on their highest performers. If you know that you are one of the top performers in the organization, if you know that you have been consistently ranked highest, if you know that you're on management track or leadership track or executive track, they may be willing to take a chance on that. But, also know there may be trade-offs on that. Part of your reputation may have been built on the fact that you were there and remote before. There may be some element of having to having the company relearn what you're able to do. So, there is an element of building that trust and building that rapport. Another one is don't underestimate the value of FaceTime. So many of my most valuable career conversations when I was in the workforce, working in an office environment, took place just by random meetings or dropping in on my manager's desk, to have a conversation, or seeing that there was another task force that they needed people to get involved with that I heard about. I could go and talk to somebody about that. So, don't underestimate the value of that. And even if you are in a remote role, a situation where you can go into the office when you want to, to be able to, have some of these interactions, it's a positive. There is definitely a benefit there. And a lot of my longtime advocates throughout my career were people that were cultivated through FaceTime. Again, beware of bad remote work deals. This is one of those cases where if the company is just trying to lower your salary as a benefit, but you end up paying more out of your pocket, that can be a problem. Another one is the work creep situation, like Sim talked about. Here it is, you've got more and more work that's showing up because you're more and more available being from home. So just be aware, there may be some trade-offs that aren't so nice. Another thought is consider entrepreneurship. The one beautiful thing about being your own boss is if you run your own business, if you run a consultancy, you have the ability to shape the job however you'd like. So to give you an example, I have my business. I do writing and coaching and, career advisory and outplacement. And, last summer when things were, kind of going crazy and, COVID was everywhere, we were able to decamp for a little while and rent a place in North Carolina in the woods and work for a little bit. We still had the internet and able to do that. But the truth of the matter is that I still have client meetings from time to time. I have, I do see situations where, you as a boss can decide, what, I want to go ahead and I want to work remotely during this time, I'm going to do it. So there are different ways to think about the trade-offs there. And being an entrepreneur gives you a lot of benefits. There's also a lot of drawbacks, by the way. If you're an entrepreneur, you eat what you kill, meaning you have to draw in your own business. You have to be doing sales. You have to constantly keep the pipeline full. You have to balance a lot of clients. So it's not for everybody. So Jeff, I'm going to hand it over to you at this point. Do we have any questions from the peanut gallery?
Scott, thanks so much. We've had a lot of comments. I don't see any questions outstanding in the chat. And again, this is your chance. You and I were talking before, predicting that our audience is going to have a lot of questions about their unique circumstances or their situations. So I would encourage everybody to take advantage of this time and ask your question. I know Scott is great with answers off the top of his head, as he's done this for us several times before. Scott, one of the things that I had said to you very early on when we talked about this presentation that I don't think that we really had a chance to dive into was, I'm concerned, being the natural pessimist that I can be, that companies are going to figure out that this is their opportunity to, you talked about like companies letting go of their real estate holdings because they can have a remote workforce. I'm concerned that companies are going to turn this into a way to turn regular positions into independent contractor positions where they no longer have to pay benefits. You've worked in HR for a long time. What are your thoughts? I mean, is that something that concern that you share? Do you see this in the future, that people who take remote positions now might find themselves down the road being told that they're no longer going to have their healthcare paid for, those kinds of things?
I think it's a real concern. I honestly do. I think that I think, again, with just so much unknown right now, I think what's going to happen, what I think kind of goes to where you're going at with that, Jeff, is I think that, under federal law, and please keep in mind, I am not an attorney, folks. I'm not an attorney, but I worked in HR, and this is my perspective. In order to be a consultant, people need to, they need to fit certain criteria, right? There's a level of independent decision making. There's a level of, responsible for your own business. There's a lot of this type of stuff. And, I think there are companies that are going to very clearly look at, how the jobs are structured, how much reporting responsibility the person really has, and they're going to make some decisions about that accordingly. And yes, I think, I think anybody that, let me phrase it this way. I think that anybody that, that stretches the relationship that they have with their employer, that makes it more difficult to see them, that makes it a little more challenging to reach them. I think anybody that's not quite as visible, anybody that doesn't get quite as much that face time is going to be vulnerable to a degree. And I think competing against somebody who does have more of that face time and that vulnerability, I think, Yeah, I think there's going to be a very real risk of that. And I think the other part of this is too, that I think companies are going to start to question in general, how much workforce do we really need? We've got, all this capital, well, if you've got less facilities, that's going to kill a lot of facilities jobs. If you've got a lot of positions that are responsible for IT, how much of it can be based, on premise versus in the cloud? I think there's going to be a lot of consequences to that. So it's kind of a long-winded answer to that, but I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take Andrea's asked a great question. I think gives us a chance to kind of pull back and take a look at this from a big picture perspective. Scott, in your work with clients so far, what are the types of jobs that you think are best positioned for remote work? Like, what are you seeing out there?
Yeah, I think, so I think the ones that are going to be the best position for remote work there's going to be two things. I think number one is individual contributor roles where you're not using a lot of capital equipment, I think is going to be, something that's going to be best equipped. So, again, I was talking about customer service. That's something you can do from anywhere. I think customer success. I think IT is one of those jobs that as long as you're not dealing with the infrastructure, there's going to be a lot of that, because how many people are dealing already with, handling issues with VPN? I think that there are certain jobs that I think are going to be less suitable to that, right? I think, I think the ones that will still are going to be sales and business development, people that are out there, they're road warriors, they're doing the work and checking with people. I think, for example, I think there's some jobs that are very challenging to do that way. So to give you an example, auditors, people that are doing audit for like Deloitte or Ernst & Young, the big four type accounting firms, when you're going and you're doing audit work and so much of it is watching people's reactions and doing interviews and talking to them in depth and trying to see security and what's going on in an environment, I think that's going to be a challenge. So I think that, I think any job that you can clearly say most of my interactions with the outside world versus what I've got on the inside is, is going to be probably one that's going to be more focused on remote work. We got some great questions here.
Yeah, we do. I want to ask these two that are related. Kate asked one in the chat that's similar to Alexis's question in the Q&A. So Alexis points out, what if hybrid can mean that you can consider a job in another city or location? For example, she lives in Boston suburbs, but we're willing to be in New York City for 3 days a week if it meant a great opportunity. Alexis, Scott, Alexis mentioned a previous webinar of yours. I'm going to actually put a link to it in the chat in a second here. You encourage people to put willing to relocate on their resume. Do you suggest something similar for willing to work remotely? But then, so pivoting to Kate's question, and I'm asking you to combine them here, there are some tax implications for that. Kate's wondering if that gets talked about or if that's like something that people should certainly be aware of that, right?
Oh, yeah. So, all right. So again, not an attorney, not an accountant, but let me say this. I'll give you an example. This week, I'm in Michigan, and my wife used to work in Detroit. We used to live in the suburbs of Detroit, and she used to commute into Detroit. The city of Detroit had a 3% tax for people that lived and worked in the city, and a 1.5% tax for people that lived outside the city but worked in the city. So I think you're going to see the tax implications for that too. People are going to have what's called a home office. I actually have a friend who worked for one of the big technology companies, and he was working remote, but he was over the state line from Massachusetts, but his office was in Massachusetts. That was his home office. So even though New Hampshire didn't pay income tax, he still ended up paying Massachusetts income tax for his work, which is kind of a really raw deal. Even though you didn't really go into the office. Now, the other part of this is, I'm going to address Alexis's comment a little bit here too, which is, the idea of, living in another metro area, but commuting a few days a week for work. And, this is a multi-layered question, right? And I'm sure Alexis knows this as well. Here it is, I know people who do commute for jobs. People who, they basically live out of a hotel or a rented sub apartment a few days a week in another city, and, and they work there as needed. But I also know of people who, and I'm sure everybody here knows one of these stories, somebody who decided to go ahead and up and decamp and move cities without even consulting their employer. And next thing you know, they're being asked to come back into the office and they're not available for meetings. So I think if you are going to, I think you're going to, if you're going to live in an area other than the job, I think the rule of hat is the rule of thumb is drop of a hat, right? If somebody calls an emergency meeting, how quickly can you get into the office for it? Are you going to be able to jump on a train and say, oh God, this is an emergency, I've got to get in here? And by the way, this isn't the same thing as a manufactured emergency. I'm talking about, guess what? We have a major layoff and we need all hands on deck to be able to deal with this. Or is this going to be something that you've got to deal with 3 days of travel to even get there? I think that's an important factor. With any company, any employment, even if you're going to work remote, I think you've got to be upfront and honest about where you're living and what your parameters are.
Got a good question from Joan. And Joan is actually a previous webinar speaker for us. Joan, I'm going to put your previous webinar also as a link in the chat. Joan is an ergonomics expert, and during the height of the pandemic, when everybody was scrambling to have a healthy workspace, Joan did a great webinar for us. So I'll put a link to that in the chat for those of you that are still getting your remote workstations configured. But Joan wants to talk more about the work creep, and she's wondering if, based on your experience, Scott, or just what your thoughts are. Again, you're not a lawyer, but do you think that the U.S. might be headed towards a situation where we're going to need to have legislation, as they do in Europe, to protect workers from being asked to work long hours without pay, outside, doing things outside of the scope of their job descriptions, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, I don't see that happening on a federal level. I don't see this government working together to get any kind of legislation done. Truthfully, I think what you're going to see is more state legislation. And I think, people will start to talk about conversations about what's really required for a job. What is an exempt job? Meaning one that you're salaried, you work overtime as needed, versus non-exempt where you're paid hourly and you get paid overtime. I wouldn't be surprised to see some states like California, for example, enact some legislation like that. But, then again, it's hard to say because employers contribute a lot to, they contribute a lot to the political environment. So I can't really say for certain, but I think there might be some states that would consider
that. Yeah, again, a lot of folks making comments and points about the tax situation, the remote work.
Well, there is a good one here, which I like Lori's question, which is if companies are going to lean towards making remote employees 1099, don't you think we could ask for an increase in salary to cover the taxes and insurance we could have to pay out of our pocket ourselves? And the answer to that is yes. Yes. Here it is. If you become an independent consultant, you can expect your cost of operating to go up by about 20 to 30%. And that's because all of a sudden you have to withhold your own taxes. You have payroll taxes that you have to pay individually. So yes, if they're going to expect that, you should probably be in a situation where you're asking for some sort of adjustment. It's not just quite as simple as taking your salary, dividing it by 2,080 hours and saying, okay, that's my hourly rate. You've got to think about all the other factors that you're going to have in there. And, in general, companies are prepared for that. In general, if they're going to have you as an independent contractor, they're usually welcoming paying you more on an hourly basis because it gives them the benefit of no long-term liabilities with you. They don't have to worry about paying for your health benefits. They don't have to worry about your pension plan or your 401k. So yeah, I think it is very much something you can ask about.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for doing this for us today. This is obviously such a new opportunity for so many folks, and it's great to have somebody like you helping people kind of fully think about the pros and cons of any work situation. So really appreciate you being here today and sharing your expertise with us.
My pleasure. Thank you. And here's my contact information if anybody would like to reach out. I do offer free resume reviews. So if you want to have your resume looked at, happy to do that. I do offer resume writing, LinkedIn profile development, career coaching, and outplacement services. So, shameless plug. If you need help, I'm here.
But you know, Scott, I say this every time. I've worked with lots of coaches over the years in running this webinar series, and I always feel like your insight just really nails kind of what the current landscape of navigating, finding a job, switching careers, those kinds of things. And so I strongly encourage folks to follow up with Scott. He's just been incredibly generous with his time, and he's a really, really smart and sharp guy. With a minute or two I've got left here, we talked a lot about LinkedIn and the great things that can happen. I fully endorse everybody making sure that you use LinkedIn as part of any job strategy, but I also want to make sure that everybody knows about BU Connects. About a year ago, we launched our own networking and mentoring community, making it easier than ever to find BU alumni who have raised their hand and said that they're willing to help or willing to be a mentor, willing to open doors at their workplace. So do me a favor, weigh in the chat here. If you've already signed up for BU Connects, let me know. I'd love to know kind of what percentage of folks here today have already heard about it, have already signed up. My pro tip for everybody is that you can sign up in minutes by signing in with your LinkedIn credentials. It pulls all your work history and everything over so that you can be up and running, making connections on BU Connects within minutes. We've got nearly 40 industry and special industry networking groups that you can join on this site. There's something for everybody. Or maybe you're really doing well in your career and want to help a student. Sign up to be a mentor. Our students need that now more than ever, particularly those seniors that are going to be graduating this year looking for a leg up and finding that first job. So that's my pitch. Got a bunch of folks. Andrea's on BU Connects. Thanks, Andrea. Looks like some of you need to get on there. So Scott, thank you again for a wonderful presentation. Always great to have you, and really appreciate all that you do for BU.
Thank you. And I just want to, I've seen a few people who have indicated they've lost their job over the past year. I want to just tell you, the good news is the market is heating up. This is a good market right now. Things are moving in the right direction. So, look, everybody's situation is unique and everybody's is individual, but I will tell you, keep some hope. Things are really going in a good direction right now, career-wise.
What a great way to end it. Thanks again, Scott. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I hope you have a great day or a great evening, wherever you might be.
Thank you.